Hi, I'd like to make a video today about 2nd Nephi chapter 15. It's the equivalent to Isaiah chapter 5 in the Old Testament. And to do this today, I thought I'd break the chapter up into three parts. The first part we've already really spent some time with in a previous video. The first 7 verses of the chapter are an allegory concerning, well, it's actually not terribly clear. There's the house of Israel is referred to. Jerusalem, the inhabitants of Jerusalem are mentioned, verse 3. Also the men or people of Judah, different translations have it as men of Judah or people of Judah. And so the parable, the allegory, there is a difference, a distinction to make between allegory and parable, but I won't go into that today. I believe it's more of an allegory, but anyway, the idea is that this may apply to the inhabitants of Jerusalem and the men of Judah, which would be the region, right? Or it also seems to have application to the whole house of Israel. Okay, so it's got possibilities to it. When I did the video last time, I actually read it as referring to Jerusalem and the region of Judah and the men of Judah. I used that particular translation to kind of make an argument about the leadership of the region of Judah, the leadership in the Jerusalem area. They had been failing in some sense because they had oppressed. They didn't exercise judgment, and this had led to oppression of the poor, and it led to an outcry by those who were less fortunate because the priesthood leaders, or the leadership in the Jerusalem / Judah, the area of Judah, they were not meeting their obligations and fulfilling their responsibilities relative to the Aaronic priesthood office that they held, whether they were priests or whether they were of the house of Levi, or if they had temple duties, or if they had other types of responsibilities. Now, in the mid portion of the chapter, we have. I'd like to break this up. The chapter heading says that there are a series of woe statements pronounced upon Israel in her scattered condition. I'm going to go ahead and break it up by a different logic. I'm going to go ahead and break it into 4 sections. And so from verse 8 to about verse 25, I'm going to suggest that we can discuss it in terms of 4 different sections. One being, well, the first, I want to highlight the indifference and the disinterest of those of the house of Israel, or again, this could be more specific to the inhabitants of Jerusalem. Their indifference and disregard for the work of the Lord. And consequently, what that leads to, and this is again from verse 8 to about verse 25, this apparently leads to a lack of knowledge of God and His laws, and spiritual hunger, but it's spiritual hunger that's they're not even aware of. In other words, their souls are famished. The multitude, it says in verse 13, they're dried up with thirst, and they have no knowledge, and therefore they've gone into captivity. Remember, Isaiah is prophesying in the 8th century, and there were some Assyrian invasions of the northern kingdom at this point, and so some had already gone into captivity or potentially had gone into captivity. This same language, though, could apply to the Babylonian invasions, closer to the 600 BC era, so about 586, 587, and so it could have to do with the taking a prophecy that has application to the Assyrian northern kingdom and invasions, that they're gone into captivity to the northern nations, or it could also have to do with the captivity leading the Babylonian takeover of Jerusalem and the captivity, the deportation that occurred in the 6th century. So anyway, again, Isaiah has multiple historical, there's history behind this, and there's different ways this could have applied. It's prophetic in Isaiah's day, but we have hindsight, the hindsight of history to determine, some of these things. But I like to apply this to our own day to some degree because the people, it says, have gone into captivity, spiritual captivity, and in some cases, we learn this in the Book of Mormon, there's a temporal captivity and there's a spiritual deliverance from captivity. And so captivity takes different forms, but I like to think of it in terms of the spiritual captivity. And it says they've gone to captivity. They've gone into captivity because they've lost a knowledge of the Lord and his laws. Now, this probably relates to their pursuing of material things and their indifference and their disregard for the work of the Lord. In verse 8 and verse 9, some of the commentary I've looked at recently about verses 8 and 9 has to do with the fact that the rich are the wealthy, the resourced are oppressing those with less by building house to house and taking field to field and forcing the poor and the less fortunate into certain situations which are disadvantageous to them. And so verses 8 and 9, is getting into some of that. And again, the lack of resources generally. Verse 10, the idea of scarcity of resources is discussed. Verse 11 says, woe unto them that rise up early. So, there was a problem with intoxication and imbibing wine and other things anciently. And this is an image that Isaiah uses not only to discuss the spiritual condition of being in apostasy or being in wickedness and sin. They're intoxicated with their iniquities. But he also means to say that they did have a problem with drunkenness. Literally, drunkenness was a problem. Rioting. In fact, verse 12, there's different ways of approaching verse 12. One is that they're riotous. They've become a riotous people. In other words, their culture is, one of partying and festivities and so forth, but they regard not the work of the Lord. They're not spiritually minded, though. Okay? Another way to look at verse 12 is that they have these instruments, the harp and the viol, the lyre. The viol is a lyre. The tabret, I believe, is a drum. And the pipe, which is a flute. That's verse 12. They're in their feast. These could be religious feasts or these could be riotous parties that we're discussing here. But anyway, they're in their feast. And if these are spiritual feasts, like the 3 feasts that the Hebrews had annually, then they're worshiping with this music, these musical instruments, but they're not really considering the work of the Lord. So it's a hypocrisy that we're talking about. Verse 12 could convey the idea of hypocrisy, or it could convey the idea of riotous living and disregard for all things that are thoughtful and spiritual, because you're so engrossed with the things of the world and eat, drinking, and being merry that you don't consider the work of the Lord. So again, some of this harkens back to what we looked at in the first chapter that was quoted here in this block of material by Isaiah. This idea of materialism. This idea of the wealthy oppressing the poor, or these building projects and so forth, and the scarcity, the economic scarcity of the time that was prophesied. Anyway, all this is discussed all the way through verse 13. Now, in verse 14, we get a similar concept to what we looked at previously in I don't know if you remember the end of 2 Nephi. We talked about how the Book of Mormon confirms that there is the doctrine of a devil, there's the doctrine of hell. Verse 14 says, because of all of these things that you're doing, Israel, again, whether this are the inhabitants of Jerusalem and Judah, or if it's the house of Israel more broadly, Isaiah himself is from Judah, but he does prophesy to the northern kingdom, and he does prophesy to the men and the inhabitants of Judah. Verse 14 says, therefore, because of these sins that I have been discussing, hell, this place called hell, hath enlarged herself. In other words, you're going to hell. You're going to be inhabiting this place. And has opened her mouth without measure to receive your glory and your multitude and your pomp. In other words, this riotous, wealthy, learned, group of Hebrews, or group from the seed of Abraham, hell has enlarged her mouth to receive you into her. Okay, and so these Jews are discussed, I think, in a way very similar to the Gentiles that were discussed and described at the end of Second Nephi. So this Isaiah material has application to the modern Gentile, because aren't the modern Gentiles engaged in these very types of iniquities and sins? This idea of pursuing aggressively wealth and profits and so forth, oppressing the poor, and having their mind towards riotous living, and also isn't there the lack of the knowledge of God, and the honorable men are famished. Okay, they're without spiritual understanding and spiritual wisdom, and just wisdom in general. Our lack of leadership in terms of not only the country, but I mean in terms of there's a real vacancy in terms of, or an emptiness in terms of our honorable men seem to be famished, and our honorable women to some degree seem to be famished in terms of spiritual things and the things of God. And the multitude, meaning the population, the demos, right? The population is dried up with thirst. So there's a lot of modern application here to these Isaiah prophecies concerning the ancient house of Israel, have application to modern Gentiles pretty directly. Now verses 15 to 17 I think are hopeful, and I think we can rejoice in them. Verse 15 says, "And the mean man shall be brought down." Now this reminds us of that chapter about, again, the haughty would be humbled and the Lord would be exalted in that day. And this kind of harkens back to a couple chapters ago when we were looking at that type of imagery. Verse 15 says, "And the mean man," now that's translated differently. That could mean the poor man, or it could mean the man who is mean. I mean, that's one. So there's different ways to look at the language, and not everybody agrees on it. The mean man shall be brought down. In other words, the mean man, at least we know, is someone who's high and mighty. He thinks too much of himself. He's puffed up in his learning or his riches or his wisdom or something, because he has to be brought down. We know that much from the language here. And the mighty man, remember we talked about the men being deported from during the Babylonian captivity. The mighty man of Israel, he will be humbled. Okay, again, suggesting pride is the problem. Pride is a problem here, like it is among the Gentiles in Nephi's writings. "And the eyes of the lofty," or the proud, right? "The eyes of the lofty shall be humbled." They're covetous. With their eyes, we covet. In other words, we see and we want what we don't have. So the eyes of the lofty are covetous, and they're going to be humbled. And this is suggested when the Lord comes, right? Or when the Lord sends judgments of any kind, whether it's, anciently he sent judgments from time to time upon the house of Israel. We also know there are judgments that have been sent on the earth more recently, and there are judgments that are ahead of us. And so the proud will be humbled whenever judgments are sent by the Lord. And he will humble the mean man and the man who's mighty, who considers himself mighty, and he will humble him to the dust. Verse 16, "But the Lord of hosts shall be exalted in judgment." In other words, when this happens, when the mighty are humbled, the Lord alone will be exalted in judgment. He will judge righteously, but he will be exalted. "And God, who is holy, shall be sanctified in righteousness." In other words, he will be a righteous judge. He will come. He's a holy God, but he brings judgment, and those that are lifted up will be brought low, and then he will be exalted in that day, and of course his covenant people. Verse 17, "Then shall the lambs," meaning those who have heard his voice, the sheep who hearken to the voice of the shepherd, right, "will feed after their manner in the green pastures, in the abundance of the pastures that are then available to them. And the waste places, all those places where God has issued judgment, the waste places shall the covenant people inherit." Okay, they shall eat in those pastures where the righteous, the covenant people who went into apostasy, they lost their privileges. They were the fat ones. Now strangers, or the covenant people, or those gathered into the covenant in the last day or in any generation, will now partake of the blessings of the gospel and eat and drink spiritually, feast, because they will be like sheep in the pasture. Where there were waste places, now there's feasting, there's there's grazing in the green past, safe, green, peaceful pastures of the Lord. Okay, so that's some of the imagery there. Now, verse 18, woe to them that draw iniquity with cords of vanity. In other words, those who get into sin because of their vain, and also they're led to these things because of their vanity. That's another word for pride. And sin, as it were, with a cart rope, okay, meaning they pull a load of sin behind them like they're a beast of burden carrying a trailer or carrying some wagon full of sin. So there's just a ton of sin. The earth is just lamenting because the people are so full of sin and iniquity. And the image is carrying it like it's a trailer of sin, a wagon full. Verse 19, that say, these people who are supposedly the people of the Lord, they say, let him speed and hasten his work, that we may see it and that we may know it. Let the counsel of the Holy One of Israel draw nigh and come. In other words, we're prepared for that day. We look forward to these things. Of course, they have no understanding, because they will, if you're a hypocrite or if you're in sin, you're not, the judgments of God, or when he comes to visit, when he comes to the earth, or in any generation when he visits the people, he blesses the righteous and he will send judgments. He needs to send judgments. It's just a natural consequence of apostasy and breaking the covenants that we've entered. Remember, covenant language is you can be blessed or you can be cursed. If you enter covenant, you're either in a blessing situation where you can keep a covenant and find the blessings of God in your life, or you can break the covenant and you can find the judgments and the cursings of God in your life, and those will come upon you just as like the sun rises in the morning, just as naturally as that. These things are part of the covenantal culture that you and I and the ancient house of Israel, have understand. Now, so they say, let him make speed, hasten his work. In other words, we want to see these things, but they're not prepared to see these things. It would not be good for them if these things came upon them, because they're not prepared. They're not spiritually prepared. They're not prepared otherwise, nor are there people. Verse 20, woe unto them that call evil good and good evil. So now in the logic of the chapter, the mid part of the chapter, we've gone from indifference to spiritual things, disinterest in spiritual things, to spiritual hunger and ignorance, to now an inversion of morality. So because they lack knowledge, and the multitude is dried up with thirst, and their honorable men are famished, now morality itself is inverted in the culture, and good is being called evil, and evil now is actually being called good. That's why they say in verse 19, let the Lord hasten his work and make speed, because they actually think they're doing good, or that they're good, when they're actually evil. Okay, in other words, you can actually, I know of a person who really believes he's close to the Lord, and yet he's about to have a disciplinary council. Or a church, there's a new name for it, but a church, a meeting relative to his church membership. A council relative to his church membership. And he actually thinks that he's close to the Lord, but he's living in a manner that suggests that he's close to excommunication, actually. And so there's a total blindness and an inversion of morality, so that, they say, let him come, let him make speed, let his work make speed. But they actually consider themselves, it's like Laman and Lemuel said of the Jews, they're righteous, they keep the law of Moses. And Lehi and Nephi said, they're about to be destroyed because God's sending judgments upon Jerusalem. And so there was a total misunderstanding, because the wicked actually are very blind to who they really are and what they're really doing. And the righteous see things clearly and as they really are, and they understand the situation. They understand the wickedness and how dark it is. And they also understand holiness and the things of holiness. And this is what is suggested in verse 21. So the culture has gone through this logic. And the thing is, the conclusion to this midsection is in verse 24 and 25, where he says, therefore, because of these things, because of all of this I've mentioned, therefore, as the fire consumeth the stubble of the field, right? You burn the corn stalks when they're down to stubble, you burn them off, and the flame consumeth the chaff, okay? Their root, meaning the house of Israel, the root, shall be rottenness, and it is rottenness because of iniquity. And their blossoms, okay, the fruit of the vine, or the fruit of the stalk, their blossoms shall go up as dust. because they have, notice this is the problem, they've cast away the law of the Lord and have not hearkened to the word of the Lord. Okay, so I said in verse 13, the people lacked knowledge. They had an indifference towards God and his laws, and they lacked knowledge in verse 13 as a result of the spiritual knowledge, as a result of this. And we're getting more specifics here in verse 24. They rejected the law of the Lord and didn't hearken to the word of the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. Therefore, they're in this place. They're under condemnation. And they're going to be scattered. If they're not already scattered, they're going to be scattered to the nations and afflicted and driven and become a hiss and a byword among the nations. Whether this is referring to the house of Israel generally, the northern kingdom, 10 tribes, or whether this is to be understood in terms of the inhabitants of Jerusalem that would be destroyed, and many carried captive into Babylon, and of course from there some never returned to their homeland. They were scattered until today among the nations of the earth. Now, verse 25 is further conclusion to this mid portion. Therefore is the anger of the Lord kindled against the people, and he hath stretched forth his hand against them. This is a stretching forth of his hand of judgment here, and hath smitten them, and the hills did tremble, and their carcasses were torn in the midst of the streets. This is all about their destruction. For all this his anger is not turned away, but his hand is still stretched out, ready to send judgments. Now, this is how the Old Testament typically is read, and Isaiah is talking about the judgments coming upon the people because of their sins. But verse 26 says, you can read this either negatively or positively. So historically, this may mean that an ensign would be lifted and the nations would come against Israel because of their iniquities, and they would be destroyed, and they would come swiftly, and they would come with power and with armaments, and they would destroy and scatter Israel. Or, in our context, this can be read more positively. Because there's great wickedness in ancient Israel, and these things are coming upon ancient Israel, and they're going to be scattered, and because the Lord has sent judgments upon them, then in a latter day, in a day of restoration, God will set up an ensign, which is again like a banner or a flag or a sign. He will set up an ensign to the nations, and the nations will gather to it, and his word will hiss forth unto them to the ends of the earth, to gather the house of Israel, that they might receive blessings of the covenant. And they shall come, those that gather shall come through the means of modern transportation in ways that are swift and powerful, and have been compared by some of the prophets to modern transportation types of vehicles like trains and planes and so forth. So there's this negative reading, a historical reading, but Isaiah can be understood in multiple ways and applications. And so because of the judgments, then God will lift an ensign to gather them. That's a positive reading. Or because of the judgments, I'm going to send the nations to gather to Israel to destroy it. And that's a negative reading, and also a reading that's been proffered here. So anyway, the chapter ends with this military imagery, or this transportation imagery. At least those are two possible ways to read it. So the chapter can be broken up into these three categories. There's logic here, but it's kind of amorphous or organic logic. It's not linear like Western thinkers like to say A and B and C. No, it's more organic and circular and kind of kaleidoscopic in terms of its structure, and it's got structure, but it's just really more difficult. It's a Hebrew, it's an Eastern kind of logic, and I just think it's really fascinating. It's very poetic, very powerful, descriptive language, but it's hard to miss the message, though, that God wants his people to keep the commandments, keep his laws, hearken to his words, and gain knowledge that they might not be destroyed and taken into captivity. And again, the latter day, the ensign would be lifted and his word would hiss forth. That means the Book of Mormon would hiss forth the other additional books of Scripture to strengthen the word that had already come forth among them. And the ensign, of course, is about, raising the work of God up in the last days and blessing the people of the earth, all who would gather to the covenant. Thank you for your time. That's chapter 15 of 2 Nephi. Hopefully I can upload this later today. And stay tuned. We'll get into, we've done already chapter 16. In a previous video, I looked at the call of Isaiah already. So we'll have to jump into our next video, chapter 17 of 2nd Nephi. Thank you.